A forbidden love, a dark secret, and a brutal crime that would leave an entire community in disbelief. How did a seemingly normal sibling bond turn into something unthinkable? And what really happened on that fateful night? There are crimes that shock, and then there are those that haunt. Cases so disturbing, they defy comprehension. This is one of those cases, a story that begins in the confines of a quiet suburban home but unravels into a chilling tale of obsession, betrayal, and bloodshed. It is a case that forces us to confront the darkest depths of human nature, where love and violence intertwine in the most unnatural of ways. Tonight, we delve deep into the unsettling reality behind this tragic story. A tale of two siblings bound by more than just blood, drawn together in ways that defy all societal norms. A connection that should have been pure, twisted into something dangerous, something deadly. What drives people to cross lines that should never be crossed? Was this a case of two lost souls entangled in a relationship they couldn't escape? Or was one of them a manipulator, luring the other into a web of deceit? And, most importantly, what led to the moment when love turned into violence? Behind closed doors, secrets fester. This case is proof that the deepest horrors are not always found in dark alleyways or in the shadows of the unknown. They can lurk where we least expect them. In the warmth of a family home. In the trust between siblings. In the place we are supposed to feel the safest. Stay with us as we unveil a twisted case of passion, deception, and a crime that defied all moral boundaries. This is the chilling story of a brother's secret affair with his own sister, and the murder that followed. To the outside world, they were just siblings, like any other. But behind closed doors, a dangerous relationship was unfolding. Every crime has an origin. A moment in time when the lines between right and wrong begin to blur. Before the shocking headlines, before the whispered rumors, before the tragic end, there was a childhood. A family. A bond that, at first glance, seemed unbreakable, but beneath the surface, something far more sinister was taking shape. They were raised under the same roof, shared the same blood, and lived what many would consider an ordinary life. A quiet neighborhood, a modest home, and parents who, by all appearances, loved their children. But appearances can be deceiving. Behind the walls of that house, something unnatural was growing, something forbidden, something dangerous. From an early age, their connection was different. Closer than most siblings. It was a bond that went beyond childhood companionship. They were inseparable. Protective of each other in a way that, at first, seemed endearing until it wasn't. Friends and relatives saw only what they were meant to see, two siblings with an unshakable bond. But those who looked closer, saw something else. Prolonged glances. Whispers behind closed doors. A closeness that made some uneasy, though few dared to voice their concerns. After all, who would suspect something so unthinkable? But the signs were there. The stolen moments. The secret conversations. The way they seemed to exist in a world of their own, one no one else was allowed to enter. And then, as they grew older, that closeness turned into something else, something darker, more secretive, more dangerous. It's easy to ignore the warning signs when the truth is too disturbing to consider. When the mind refuses to believe that such a thing could happen in a normal, respectable home. But darkness does not announce its arrival. It seeps in slowly, unnoticed, until it is too late. Was it a relationship born out of loneliness? A misguided sense of love? Or was there something far more manipulative at play? Did one of them lead the other down this path, or was it inevitable from the start? What began as a childhood bond had transformed into something unnatural. Something that defied every moral boundary. And yet, they were willing to risk everything to keep it hidden. But secrets like this never stay buried forever. And when they are finally exposed, the consequences are devastating. This was not just an affair. This was a ticking time bomb. And soon, it would explode in the most violent way imaginable. At what point did their relationship shift from innocent to something deeply disturbing? And what kept it hidden for so long? Some secrets begin with a single moment, a glance that lingers too long, an innocent touch that crosses an unspoken line. But others evolve gradually, creeping into existence so slowly that those involved don't realize the depth of their transgression until they are too far gone to turn back. This was one of those secrets. To those on the outside, they were just close siblings. Perhaps a little too close, but nothing that raised alarm. They spent an unusual amount of time together, confiding in one another in a way most brothers and sisters did not. Their connection was intense, their dependency on each other undeniable. But no one, not their parents, not their friends, not their neighbors, could have imagined the truth. The first sign came in subtle ways: locked doors, whispered conversations, prolonged silences when someone entered the room. There were stolen moments in the dead of night, footsteps echoing in hallways long after the rest of the house had fallen silent. Messages erased, glances exchanged, the air between them charged with something unspeakable. How did it begin? Was it a gradual erosion of boundaries? Or a moment of weakness that spiraled into obsession? Perhaps it started as comfort, an escape from loneliness or dysfunction within their home. But at some point, the lines blurred, and what was once natural became something deeply unnatural. And once they crossed that threshold, there was no turning back. They knew it was wrong. Every stolen moment carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken consequences. And yet, they could not stop. Their world had shrunk to just the two of them, an intoxicating mix of secrecy and desire. But love built on a foundation of deceit is not love at all, it is a time bomb, waiting for the inevitable explosion. Hiding the truth became second nature. They mastered the art of deception, crafting lies with expert precision. To their parents, they were normal. To their friends, they were just siblings with an unusually strong bond. But behind the facade, the affair grew more reckless, more consuming, and, in time, more dangerous. Were they afraid of being discovered? Or did the secrecy make it all the more thrilling? The fear, the shame, the desperation to keep the truth buried, it only fueled the fire. But secrets like these do not stay hidden forever. The more they tried to suppress it, the more it threatened to consume them. And then, the cracks began to show. Whispers started to circulate. A friend noticed how they looked at each other, how their arguments carried an intensity that went beyond sibling rivalry. Their mother walked in on a moment that lasted a second too long, a touch, a glance, a presence too close for comfort. The father began questioning why his son had started lashing out, why his daughter had become withdrawn, secretive, lost in her own world. The truth had begun to claw its way to the surface. And with it, the first signs of unraveling. Jealousy crept in, a slow poison seeping into their already fragile dynamic. Did he grow possessive? Did she attempt to pull away? A love built on secrecy is never stable. It festers, it corrodes, it turns even the closest of bonds into something ugly. And soon, the inevitable began to unfold. Obsession. Manipulation. Control. The balance had shifted, and the once mutual secret had become a power struggle. Perhaps she wanted to end it. Perhaps she saw the writing on the wall. Maybe she realized that what they had built was unsustainable, that the weight of their secret would one day crush them. But walking away was never going to be that simple. Because love like this doesn't fade. It doesn't resolve itself quietly. It festers, it twists, it destroys. The tension between them was no longer something that could be hidden. The walls were closing in, the pressure mounting. And then, a final argument, a confrontation that would change everything. Did she threaten to expose the truth? Did he refuse to let her go? Was it love, or was it possession? Whatever was said in those last moments, one thing was certain: this was no longer about passion. This was about control. The affair that had once been their greatest secret had now become their greatest threat. And as their relationship crumbled, so did any chance of escaping unscathed. Because when love turns to obsession, it can end in only one way. And for one of them, it would end in death. A deadly argument, a moment of uncontrollable rage, and a crime scene so gruesome, it left investigators speechless. All forbidden relationships eventually reach a breaking point. For these siblings, their secret was no longer just a burden, it was a ticking time bomb. The walls were closing in, the tension suffocating, the weight of what they had done becoming unbearable. And then, on one fateful night, everything spiraled out of control. The argument began like so many before it, voices rising, accusations thrown like daggers, emotions running dangerously high. But this time, something was different. This wasn't just another fight. This wasn't just another clash of jealousy, guilt, or desperation. This was the moment where everything they had tried to hide, everything they had built their lives around, came crashing down. Was it about ending things? Did she finally say the words he had feared the most? This is over. Words that should have been an escape, a way out of a relationship that should have never existed in the first place. But to him, they were a betrayal. A rejection too unbearable to accept. Or perhaps it was something more sinister. A threat. A confession. A moment where she finally realized there was no way forward, only ruin in every direction. Did she tell him she was going to expose the truth? To come clean to their parents? To let the world know what they had done? Whatever was said, whatever words passed between them in those final, agonizing moments, it was enough to push him over the edge. What happened next was not a calculated crime. It was not premeditated murder. It was an explosion of fury, a loss of control so absolute that there was no turning back. One moment, they were two people locked in an argument, and in the next, the room was filled with nothing but terror and blood. The attack was brutal. Frenzied. A crime of passion in the most horrifying sense. She never had a chance to run, never had a moment to fight back. The force of the assault was overwhelming, the violence beyond comprehension. There was no hesitation, no pause, just raw, unrelenting rage unleashed in the most devastating way possible. What weapon did he use? A knife from the kitchen? A blunt object in arm's reach? Or was it his bare hands, an act so personal, so filled with blind fury that it left no doubt about his intent? The injuries would later tell their own story, of a struggle, of desperation, of a life extinguished far too soon. And then, silence. The kind of silence that follows only after the unthinkable has occurred. The kind that settles over a room drenched in chaos, the air thick with the aftermath of something that can never be undone. Reality never hits immediately. There is always a moment, a breath, a pause, a heartbeat, where time seems to stop, where the mind struggles to comprehend what has just happened. He must have stood there, staring at what he had done, hands trembling, breath ragged, the weight of his actions crashing down like an avalanche. Did he cry? Did he panic? Did he try to convince himself that this wasn't real? That if he closed his eyes and reopened them, she would be alive, that this was just another nightmare, another fight they could somehow come back from. But there was no coming back from this. No apology could fix what had been done. No secret could hide this now. Because she was gone, and the only thing left in that room was death. And so, the question remained, what would he do next? Run? Cover his tracks? Call the police and confess in a fit of remorse? Or would he do what so many killers before him had done, try to erase the evidence, try to rewrite the story, try to convince the world that he had nothing to do with the very crime his own hands had committed? But covering up a murder is not as easy as it seems. And no matter how carefully he planned, no matter what lies he told himself, he had already made the one mistake he could never undo. He had killed his own sister. And sooner or later, the truth would catch up to him. As police pieced together the gruesome puzzle, shocking secrets began to surface, and the case took a chilling turn. It started with a single phone call, a panicked voice, trembling with fear, reporting a discovery too horrific to comprehend. A body, lifeless and broken, lying in a pool of blood. A crime scene so disturbing that even the most seasoned investigators would later recall it with a shudder. When law enforcement arrived, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The air was still, almost suffocating, as if the very walls of the home were holding on to the horror of what had transpired. Officers stepped cautiously over the threshold, their boots leaving faint imprints in the blood-spattered floor. The stench of iron filled their nostrils, a scent every detective knew too well. It was the unmistakable presence of death. The scene was chaotic. Furniture overturned, shards of broken glass glistening under dim lighting, dark red streaks smeared across the walls, a silent testament to the violence that had unfolded mere hours before. But amidst the destruction, there was something else. A feeling. A presence. The eerie sensation that whatever had happened in that room was more than just an act of rage. It was something deeper. Something darker. As forensic specialists worked meticulously, photographing every angle, collecting fibers, analyzing blood splatter patterns, the gravity of the crime began to take shape. The wounds on the victim's body were savage, excessive. This was not a calculated killing, it was emotional, frenzied, personal. The kind of crime that came from a place of unbearable torment, unchecked fury, and uncontrollable passion. The detectives knew one thing for certain: this was not the work of a stranger. This was not a random act of violence. Whoever had done this had known the victim intimately. And that realization led them to a terrifying question: who, in her life, was capable of such a thing? Then came the first red flag: there were no signs of forced entry. No broken locks, no shattered windows, no pried open doors. Whoever had been in that house had been there willingly. Which meant that the person responsible had been someone she trusted. It didn't take long for suspicion to settle on the one person whose behavior was beginning to unravel: her brother. When questioned, his responses were shaky. His eyes darted nervously, his voice cracked under the weight of his own words. At first, He feigned ignorance, insisting he had no idea what had happened. But detectives had seen it before, guilt, creeping in like a shadow, twisting its way through every syllable of a lie. And then, there were the inconsistencies. The timeline didn't add up. His alibi was weak. Witnesses recalled hearing raised voices the night before, a heated argument echoing through the walls, followed by an eerie silence that lasted until morning. But the most damning evidence? The forensic analysis. Blood stains, tiny, almost invisible to the naked eye, lingered on his clothing. A single fingerprint, smudged in crimson, was found on the very weapon that had ended his sister's life. And then, there was the discovery that turned the case upside down: hidden messages. Diary entries. Notes exchanged between them. Pieces of a disturbing puzzle that revealed a relationship far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The investigators were no longer looking at a simple homicide. This was something far more sinister. A tangled web of forbidden emotions, power struggles, and secrets buried beneath years of deception. The evidence told a story no one wanted to believe: a sibling bond that had crossed the line, a love that had become an obsession, and a tragic descent into madness that had ended in murder. With each new revelation, the town's disbelief turned into horror. How had no one seen the signs? How had a relationship so unnatural, so dangerous, remained hidden for so long? And most importantly, what had truly happened in those final moments before blood was spilled? Detectives pressed harder, determined to break through the wall of silence. Hours stretched into days, interrogations growing more intense, psychological evaluations revealing glimpses of a mind unraveling under the weight of its own guilt. And then, finally, the moment they had been waiting for. He cracked. His voice wavered, hands shaking, the pressure too much to bear. He spoke of jealousy, of desperation, of love twisted into something monstrous. He claimed it had been an accident, an argument that had spiraled out of control. But the evidence said otherwise. The brutality, the excessive force, the attempt to cover it up, these were not the actions of a man who had lost control for a mere moment. These were the choices of someone who had been consumed by something darker. With his confession, the pieces fell into place. The crime was solved, the mystery unraveled. But for the victim's family, for the community that once knew them as ordinary siblings, there would never be true closure. The scars left behind by this crime were permanent, a haunting reminder of a love that had never been meant to exist, and a murder that could never be undone. As the trial loomed, the world watched with bated breath. Would justice be served? Would the truth finally be laid bare? Or would the courtroom become yet another stage for the twisted tragedy that had already claimed one life, and shattered so many others? In court, shocking revelations left the jury in disbelief. But would justice be served? The courtroom was packed. Spectators, journalists, and legal analysts filled every available seat, their eyes fixed on the accused, the brother whose dark secret had shattered a family and horrified an entire community. He sat rigid, dressed in a suit that didn't quite fit, his face pale and unreadable. His once confident demeanor had crumbled under the weight of the charges against him. The air was thick with tension, as though the very walls of the courthouse could feel the gravity of the case unfolding within them. The prosecution wasted no time painting a vivid picture of what had transpired. They laid out the evidence in painstaking detail: crime scene photographs, forensic reports, psychological assessments, and most damning of all, the chilling confession that had emerged during the investigation. The jury listened in stunned silence as the prosecutor described the violent nature of the crime, emphasizing the sheer brutality of the attack. This was no accident, no heat-of-the-moment mistake. This was a crime driven by jealousy, obsession, and years of pent-up emotions that had finally erupted in the most gruesome way imaginable. Witnesses were called to the stand, each one adding another layer to the unfolding tragedy. A close friend of the victim recounted the subtle but disturbing signs she had noticed: whispers of secrecy, changes in behavior, a tension that seemed to hang between the siblings like an unspoken truth. A former neighbor described the heated arguments, the late-night fights that often ended in eerie silence. And then, there were the family members, their voices quivering with sorrow as they recalled the moment they learned the horrifying truth. A mother who had lost her daughter. A father who now faced the unbearable reality of having one child murdered and the other accused of taking her life. But perhaps the most unsettling testimony came from the forensic psychologist who had spent hours analyzing the defendant. He spoke of deep psychological wounds, of a man torn between forbidden desires and self-loathing, of a relationship that had strayed so far beyond normal boundaries that it had become something toxic, something dangerous. He was trapped in his own delusions, the expert stated. He convinced himself that their love was justified, that it was real, that no one else could ever understand. The defense, however, sought to present a different narrative. They argued that the crime had not been premeditated, that their client had acted in a moment of uncontrollable rage, blinded by emotions too overwhelming to process. They described him as a man haunted by his own guilt, a deeply troubled individual whose actions were not those of a cold-blooded killer, but of someone who had lost his grip on reality. The defense attorney implored the jury to consider his mental state, to understand the torment that had driven him to commit such an unspeakable act. Does he deserve punishment? The attorney asked. Yes. But does he deserve life behind bars, treated as a monster beyond redemption? That is for you to decide. The jury deliberated for hours, hours that felt like days. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, awaiting the verdict that would determine whether justice had truly been served. Reporters speculated on the possible outcomes, legal analysts debated the nuances of the case, and the victim's family sat in quiet agony, waiting for the moment that would forever alter the course of their lives. The jury deliberated for hours, hours that felt like days. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, awaiting the verdict that would determine whether justice had truly been served. Reporters speculated on the possible outcomes, legal analysts debated the nuances of the case, and the victim's family sat in quiet agony, waiting for the moment that would forever alter the course of their lives. When the jury finally returned, the tension in the room became unbearable. The judge asked the foreperson to stand, and the courtroom held its collective breath. The verdict was read in a voice that trembled slightly, but carried the weight of an entire community's judgment. Guilty. A wave of emotion rippled through the courtroom. Gasps, muffled sobs, the sound of relief mixed with devastation. The defendant's face remained blank for a moment, as if his mind had yet to process the reality of what had just happened. And then, his shoulders slumped, his head dipped slightly, the only outward sign of the crushing weight of his fate. The sentencing phase followed soon after. The prosecution pushed for the harshest penalty possible, citing the gruesome nature of the crime and the clear evidence of obsession and manipulation. The defense pleaded for leniency, arguing that their client was not beyond rehabilitation, that he had already condemned himself in ways no court ever could. But the judge's voice was unwavering as he delivered the final judgment. Years behind bars. No possibility of early release. A lifetime to sit with the consequences of what he had done. As the gavel struck, signaling the case's conclusion, a heavy silence settled over the room. The legal proceedings had ended, but the wounds left behind by this tragedy would never truly heal. A sister's life had been taken. A brother's future had been erased. And a family had been torn apart in a way that could never be mended. Outside the courthouse, reporters scrambled for statements. Legal experts dissected every aspect of the trial. But for those closest to the case, there were no more words. Only grief, only regret, only the lingering question that would never have a satisfying answer: how had it come to this? And could it ever have been stopped before it was too late? With the trial over, the world moved on. The headlines faded. The news cycle shifted to the next big story. But for those who had lived through it, the horror remained, a haunting memory of a love that should never have been, a crime that could never be undone, and a verdict that, no matter how just, could never bring back what was lost. Even after the case was closed, disturbing questions remained. Was justice really served? And could this tragedy have been prevented? The courtroom doors had closed. The cameras had been turned off. The world, always hungry for the next sensational story, had already begun shifting its attention elsewhere. But for those left behind, the nightmare was far from over. In the quiet aftermath of the trial, grief lingered like a shadow, creeping into the lives of those who had once been at the center of this horrific tale. There was no true sense of closure, only the weight of loss, the sting of unanswered questions, and the haunting realization that this tragedy had been set in motion long before the crime itself was committed. For the victims' parents, life had become an unbearable paradox. They had lost one child to violence, the other to incarceration. The son they had once cradled in their arms, the boy they had raised and nurtured, was now a convicted murderer. The daughter they had watched grow into a young woman, full of promise and potential, was now gone forever. The home they had built, once filled with laughter and warmth, had become a house of mourning, a constant reminder of everything they had lost. Every framed photograph, every piece of furniture, every lingering memory was a painful echo of the past, a past that could never be reclaimed. But beyond the walls of their broken home, the case had ignited a firestorm of public debate. Some saw the brother as a monster, a man who had crossed lines that should never have been crossed. They argued that his punishment had been too lenient, that a life sentence, or worse, would have been the only fitting end to such a horrific crime. Others, however, viewed him as a tragic figure, a man consumed by emotions he could neither understand nor control. They questioned whether his actions had been entirely his own, or if the circumstances of his upbringing had played a role in shaping his fate. Psychologists, sociologists, and criminologists dissected every aspect of the case. They examined the complexities of sibling relationships, the psychological trauma that can lead to taboo desires, and the dangerous consequences of unchecked obsession. Experts debated whether this crime was an anomaly or a symptom of deeper, more pervasive issues within society. Could early intervention have stopped the affair before it spiraled into something deadly? Had there been warning signs that were ignored, dismissed as harmless, or simply unnoticed until it was too late? Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the case was the lingering question of intent. Had the brother always harbored violent impulses? Or had he been pushed to the breaking point by the weight of secrecy, jealousy, and emotional turmoil? The forensic evidence suggested a moment of unbridled rage, but what had truly triggered that fatal outburst? A lover's quarrel? The threat of exposure? Or had it been something even darker, something that would never be fully understood? And then, there was the question of the sister herself. Though she had been the victim, her role in the relationship was scrutinized as well. Had she been a willing participant in their secret affair? Or had she been manipulated, coerced by a brother who wielded control over her in ways no one had realized? Some believed she had been trapped in a dynamic she didn't know how to escape, that fear or guilt had kept her silent. Others speculated that love, however misguided, had played a part in her reluctance to break away. But now, the only person who could have provided those answers was gone, leaving behind a mystery that would remain unsolved forever. In prison, the brother remained eerily quiet. Unlike other high-profile criminals who sought to tell their side of the story in interviews, books, or letters, he refused to speak about what had happened. He offered no insights, no explanations, no attempts at redemption. Some believed he was consumed by guilt, drowning in the realization of what he had done. Others suspected he had simply accepted his fate, knowing that nothing he could say would ever change the past. But there were those who whispered a more unsettling theory, that he still believed in the love he had lost, that he saw himself not as a villain, but as a man who had acted out of passion rather than malice. In the years that followed, the case became the subject of true crime documentaries, investigative articles, and heated online discussions. Amateur sleuths dissected every detail, analyzing old photographs, poring over trial transcripts, searching for missed clues that might explain what had gone so terribly wrong. Was there something deeper at play? Something hidden in their childhood, in their family history, in the very fabric of their lives that had led to this tragedy? Or was it simply the culmination of choices, small, seemingly insignificant choices, that had led down an irreversible path? Despite the passage of time, the victim's name was never forgotten. Her story served as a grim reminder of the dangers that lurk beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary lives. Schools and universities used the case as a study in psychology courses, dissecting the complexities of forbidden relationships, emotional dependency, and the warning signs of obsessive behavior. And still, the questions remained: was this an isolated case? Or were there other stories, hidden in the shadows, waiting to surface? In the end, the world moved on. The headlines faded, replaced by new scandals, new tragedies, new horrors. But for those who had known the siblings, who had shared their lives and their secrets, the echoes of the past never truly faded. A mother still set an empty plate at the dinner table, unable to let go of the child she had lost. A father avoided the places where his family had once been whole, unable to face the reminders of what had been taken from him. Friends spoke in hushed tones, careful not to say too much, afraid of stirring up memories too painful to confront. But the truth remained, lingering like a ghost in the shadows. A brother and sister had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. A love that should have been pure had turned into something twisted, something dangerous. And in the end, one life had been taken, another had been ruined, and a family had been left in ruins. The world may have forgotten. But for those who lived through it, the nightmare would never truly end. What do you think? Was this crime an act of passion or pure evil? Was the brother a victim of his own emotions, spiraling into a darkness he could not control? Or was this a calculated crime, driven by something far more sinister? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, because the truth, as always, is never as simple as it seems. Cases like this remind us that the most chilling crimes don't always come from the shadows. Sometimes, they unfold within the very walls we call home. Sometimes, love and obsession blur into something unrecognizable, something dangerous. And sometimes, the people we trust the most are the ones capable of the deepest betrayals. The aftermath of this case serves as a warning, a reminder that secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of coming to light. That love, when twisted beyond recognition, can become the very thing that destroys. And that sometimes, the most unthinkable crimes don't come from strangers, but from those we least expect. And that concludes the tragic and unsettling case of Ethan Caldwell and Isabel Caldwell, siblings bound by blood but torn apart by a dark and forbidden secret. A story that left their parents, Margaret and Richard Caldwell, shattered, a community in disbelief, and a best friend, Lucas Bennett, struggling to make sense of what went so terribly wrong. Detective Hannah Roberts uncovered the chilling truth, while prosecutor James Whitmore fought for justice in the courtroom. On the other side, defense attorney Rebecca Lawson sought to explain the unexplainable, as Judge Alan Grayson delivered the final verdict that sealed Ethan's fate. A case that serves as a grim reminder that some secrets, no matter how deeply buried, will always find their way to the surface, sometimes with devastating consequences. Thank you for watching. If this story shocked you, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Was this a crime fueled by passion, obsession, or something far more sinister? Small blue diamond encourage engagement. White heavy checkmark if you found this case shocking. Don't forget to subscribe for more gripping true crime stories. Every week, we dive deep into the most disturbing, unsettling, and thought-provoking cases that defy belief. White heavy checkmark. What drives someone to commit the ultimate crime? Is there ever a justification? Stay tuned for our next episode, where we uncover yet another dark and twisted case that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about human nature. Until next time, stay safe, and always remember, sometimes, the scariest monsters aren't the ones hiding in the dark, they're the ones standing right beside us.